Karmelo Anthony, the teenager convicted of murder just 2 weeks ago for the stabbing death of Austin Metcalf at a high school track meet last year, has landed himself a new pro bono legal team that is major as his appeal process begins. And I want to be clear about something. These are no lightweights. And I got to ask, does he have a shot at a new trial? Now, this case drew national attention for a number of reasons, including an intensely debated self-defense claim that landed in the hands of a jury, that no black jurors were on that jury, that, remember, Anthony's black, Metcalf was white, both were 17 at the time. Anthony was sentenced to 35 years in prison, but his new appellate legal team is looking to change all that. This team consists of...
On an ordinary spring afternoon, a high school track meet in Texas transformed from a celebration of competition into the scene of a tragedy that would dominate headlines across the nation. Within moments, students who had been cheering from the stands were calling for help. Coaches sprinted toward the chaos. First responders raced to save a teenager whose life was slipping away in front of classmates who would never forget what they had witnessed. That teenager was Austin Metcalf. Another teenager, Karmelo Anthony, would soon find himself at the center of one of the most divisive criminal cases in recent memory. What began as a brief confrontation between two young men ended with one family planning a funeral and another preparing for a murder trial that would stretch over months, ignite fierce public debate, and divide millions of people online. When the jury ultimately returned a guilty verdict and Karmelo Anthony was sentenced to 35 years in prison, many believed the legal chapter had come to a close. But it didn't. Days later, his parents appeared publicly for the first time since the conviction. Fighting back emotion, they insisted their son had not received a fair trial. They described themselves as delusional for believing the justice system would give them what they called a fair opportunity, while maintaining that their son acted in self-defense and announcing that they intended to continue fighting through the appeals process. Those statements quickly became national news, fueling another wave of heated reactions across television, social media, and legal commentary. But beneath the political arguments, viral clips, and endless opinions lies a far more haunting reality. Two families woke up on the morning of the track meet expecting nothing more than another day of school athletics. By nightfall, one family had lost a son forever. The other faced the unimaginable possibility that their own son would spend decades behind bars. The tragedy itself lasted only seconds. The consequences will last generations. As investigators reconstructed those final moments, prosecutors argued that the evidence showed an unjustified killing. Defense attorneys argued that Anthony believed he was protecting himself during a confrontation. After hearing testimony and reviewing the evidence presented in court, the jury rejected the self-defense claim and found him guilty of murder, setting the stage for a sentencing hearing that would bring even more emotion into an already heartbreaking case. Yet even after the verdict, the questions refused to disappear. Why did such a brief encounter escalate so dramatically? Could anything have prevented it? Did warning signs exist before that fatal afternoon? And why do so many people continue to see the very same evidence in completely different? Understand why Karmelo Anthony's parents later said they were delusional. It's necessary to go back to the beginning. Before the courtroom, before the interviews, before the verdict became a national headline. Because every true crime story starts long before the crime itself. In this case, the first clues were hiding in plain sight. Before the courtroom arguments and nationwide headlines, this was a story about two teenagers whose futures seemed wide open. Both attended the same Texas high school community, surrounded by classmates, coaches, and families who expected the day of the track meet to end with medals, not mourning. Austin Metcalf was remembered by those who knew him as a hardworking student-athlete with ambitious goals and a close relationship with his family. His life revolved around school, sports, and the friendships that come with growing up. Karmelo Anthony was also a teenager with dreams and responsibilities, but in the months after the incident, his name became known across America for reasons no family would ever want. As investigators pieced together the events, supporters and critics quickly formed competing narratives, even before every fact had been presented in court. The prosecution would later argue that the evidence showed an unjustified act of violence. The defense maintained that Anthony believed he was acting in self-defense. Those opposing accounts would ultimately be tested before a jury, not on social media. As emotions intensified online, the families found themselves living through unimaginable grief under a relentless public spotlight. Every court filing, interview, and hearing became national news, making it nearly impossible to separate fact from speculation. Before we continue, if you enjoy carefully researched true crime stories that focus on verified facts rather than rumors, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Cold Case Files, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new investigation. The warning signs leading to that tragic afternoon would only become clearer in hindsight. As investigators began reconstructing the moments before the fatal confrontation, they focused on a simple but critical question. How had an ordinary school track meet escalated into a deadly encounter in just seconds? Witness statements and evidence presented in court described a disagreement that began in a seating area designated for one school's team. According to testimony, a verbal exchange followed, and tensions rose quickly. What started as a dispute over where someone was sitting became the kind of conflict that, under different circumstances, might have ended with nothing more than harsh words. Instead, it continued. During the trial, prosecutors argued that the confrontation did not justify the use of deadly force. The defense maintained that Karmelo Anthony believed he was facing an immediate threat and acted in self-defense. Jurors were tasked with weighing those competing claims against witness testimony, physical evidence, and the applicable law. One of the most sobering aspects of the case is how rapidly emotions overtook reason. There was no evidence presented of a long-running feud between the two teenagers. Yet a brief, emotionally charged encounter produced irreversible consequences. For classmates who witnessed the aftermath, the memories would remain long after the track meet ended. For both families, life became divided into two chapters: everything before that afternoon and everything after it. The events that followed would shift the focus from the scene itself to the painstaking work of investigators determined to establish exactly what happened and why. The moments that followed were chaotic. Students scattered as teachers and coaches rushed toward the scene, while emergency responders fought desperately to save Austin Metcalf's life. Despite their efforts, he died from the stab wound, turning what had begun as a routine school event into a homicide investigation. Law enforcement quickly secured the area, interviewing witnesses while the memories were still fresh. Investigators collected physical evidence, reviewed photographs and videos recorded at the scene, and worked to establish an accurate timeline of the confrontation. As the investigation progressed, prosecutors argued that the evidence showed the use of deadly force was not legally justified. The defense, however, maintained that Karmelo Anthony believed he faced an immediate threat and acted in self-defense. Those competing narratives became the central issue that would later be decided in court. The case drew intense national attention almost immediately. Social media filled with opinions, speculation, and misinformation, often long before verified facts emerged. Investigators repeatedly emphasized the importance of relying on evidence rather than online narratives. Behind every headline were two families living through unimaginable heartbreak. One was mourning the sudden loss of a son. The other faced the reality that their son's future would now be decided inside a courtroom. As detectives completed their investigation and prosecutors prepared formal charges, the legal battle was only beginning. The evidence gathered in those first critical hours would soon become the foundation of a closely watched murder trial that captivated the nation. As the case moved toward trial, both sides prepared to present sharply different interpretations of the same tragic event. Prosecutors argued that the evidence, including witness testimony and forensic findings introduced in court, showed the killing was not legally justified. The defense maintained that Karmelo Anthony reasonably believed he faced an immediate threat and acted in self-defense. Jurors listened as investigators, witnesses, and experts described the sequence of events. They were instructed to evaluate only the evidence presented in court and apply the law as explained by the judge, setting aside the intense public debate that surrounded the case. Outside the courtroom, emotions continued to run high. News coverage and social media discussions often reflected deeply divided opinions, but inside the courtroom, the verdict would depend solely on the testimony, exhibits, and legal standards presented during the trial. If you're finding this case informative, please support Cold Case Files by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and turning on notifications. It helps us continue producing carefully researched, evidence-based true crime stories. After deliberating, the jury rejected the self-defense claim and returned a guilty verdict for murder. The decision marked a turning point in the case, but it did not end the story. Sentencing still lay ahead, and both families would soon face another emotionally devastating chapter as the court determined what justice would ultimately look like. When the trial entered its final stage, the courtroom shifted from determining guilt to deciding punishment. During the sentencing phase, both the prosecution and the defense presented arguments about what sentence would be appropriate, asking the court to consider not only the crime itself, but also its lasting impact. The prosecution emphasized the irreversible loss suffered by Austin Metcalf's family, arguing that a young life had been taken in an act the jury had already determined was not justified by self-defense. The defense asked the court to weigh Karmelo Anthony's age and future, urging that his youth be considered when imposing a sentence. After considering the evidence and the jury's recommendation, the court sentenced Anthony to 35 years in prison. The verdict and sentence immediately became national news, drawing strong reactions from legal analysts, community members, and people who had closely followed the case from the beginning. For Austin's loved ones, the sentence represented a measure of accountability, though no court decision could undo their loss. For Anthony's family, it marked the beginning of a new legal battle, as they publicly stated they intended to pursue an appeal, maintaining that the conviction should be overturned. Although the courtroom proceedings had concluded, the emotional weight of the case remained. The legal process was over, but for everyone directly affected, the consequences would continue long after the cameras were gone. In the days following the sentencing, the focus shifted from the courtroom to the families left to live with the consequences. Austin Metcalf's loved ones continued to grieve the loss of a son whose future ended in an instant. They spoke about preserving his memory and finding strength through one another, even as the pain remained impossible to erase. Karmelo Anthony's family, meanwhile, addressed the public for the first time after the conviction. They said they felt they had been delusional in believing the justice system would produce what they considered a fair outcome. While expressing heartbreak over the situation, they continued to maintain that their son acted in self-defense and announced plans to challenge the conviction through the appeals process. Their comments reignited national debate. Some believed the verdict reflected the evidence presented at trial and the jury's careful deliberation. Others questioned aspects of the case and argued that the appeal deserved close attention. Whatever the opinion, the legal process had not necessarily reached its final chapter. For classmates, teachers, and the wider community, the tragedy left lasting emotional scars. A place meant for school spirit and athletic achievement had become forever linked to unimaginable loss. Beyond the headlines and courtroom arguments, one truth remained unchanged. A young life was gone, another young life faced decades behind bars, and two families would carry the weight of that spring afternoon for the rest of their lives. As the headlines begin to fade, the lasting impact of this case remains impossible to ignore. What started as a brief confrontation at a high school track meet changed countless lives forever. One family continues to mourn Austin Metcalf, while another faces the reality of Karmelo Anthony serving a lengthy prison sentence as his legal team pursues the appeals process. The case also serves as a reminder of how quickly ordinary moments can turn into irreversible tragedies. In just seconds, emotions overtook judgment, leaving consequences that no verdict can truly erase. While public opinion remains deeply divided, the jury's decision was based on the evidence and testimony presented in court, rejecting the claim of self-defense. For both families, there are no real winners. One lost a son forever. The other lost the future they had imagined for theirs. Long after the news cameras move on, they will continue living with the consequences of that day. If you believe factual, carefully researched true crime stories matter, please support Cold Case Files by liking this video, sharing it with others, subscribing to the channel, and turning on notifications so you never miss a new investigation. As new legal developments emerge, we'll continue following this case with the same commitment to verified facts over speculation. And now, we'd like to hear from you. Do you believe the jury reached the right verdict based on the evidence presented in court, or do you think the appeal could change the outcome? Let us know your thoughts respectfully in the comments below.